to. To you, what is product market fit?
It's honestly a mathematical equation. It is, you
Great.
have, yeah, no, it's, you have a set of users that will be in, like, hopefully they're paying an amount to start with that can point to this, but will be willing to pay enough to generate a really big market size. And so a benchmark for that early on is like, are there enough users out there willing to pay you enough that you can generate 100 million ARR with your business? So you can't kind of go into monetizing an open source community in a rushed way, because it's like, first and foremost, it's a community that's centered around the movement that is your project. I don't really spend that much time on slide decks, and even when like companies are pitching us, I usually opt for them not to use it, because what I'm really looking for is depth of interaction. Have the founders actually reached out and gotten to know their users and their pain points, and do they really understand their journey, and are they really building for them?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Hacking Open Source Business Podcast. I'm one of the co-hosts, Matt Yonkovit, joined once again by Avi Press. And today we have a special guest, Robby Robson from Cowboy Ventures. How are you, Robby?
I'm good. So it's like Cher. It's one name. It's just Robby, which comes from Robson. So my first name's actually Amanda, but I have always gone by a version of my last name. But I do like Robby Robson. It has a nice ring to it.
There you go.
I never thought about that until now. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't even think about it until now either. Yeah. So, okay. So there we go. So apologies for using your last name twice.
We're here for it.
Yeah. That's right. All right, fair enough. So, Robby, we start this with a series of 137 questions to get to know you. And Avi only lets me have 10 minutes, so we have to go really fast on it. I mean, Avi's just, he's like 10 minutes and that's it.
We got a lot of other things to talk about.
And I have 137 questions, but it's rapid fire mode. We like to get to know you before we get, properly introduced to your background and stuff. Just to kind of fire some things in there and see what comes out of it. It's fun for all of us. It's fun for all the kids.
I love it. I'm here for it.
So, all right. So, Robby, when you're not working, what are you most likely doing?
Working out in some way, shape, or form. A lot of running, a lot of biking, a lot of Barry's boot camp, dare I say, being a tech meme all on my own.
Fair enough. And so, when you are out there and you're running, you're doing your exercising, where's your favorite place to go?
So I live really close to Golden Gate Park. I'm in Nopa, so that's my most convenient and also most frequented running path.
Awesome.
Lovely.
And so, out of curiosity, do you have pets or do you like pets?
I love pets. I don't have pets currently.
Okay.
That could change.
Cat or dog person?
It sucks because I'm a dog person, but I'm more likely to get a cat just because it's much more convenient with my travel schedule.
Oh, sorry, we broke up a little bit there. Avi, did you have it break up too?
Yeah, I also the audio just fully cut out for a sec there.
Yeah, okay. So I don't know if you caught the question.
Sorry, I can give you a repeat on it. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
was very temporary.
My Wi-Fi
it was very temporary, but that's okay.
Okay,
that's
awesome.
Okay. So you said you are an animal person.
I am more of a dog person, but I'm more likely to get a cat just because it's much more convenient with my travel schedule.
That makes sense.
Fair enough. So what book do you recommend the most?
Probably Untethered Soul, and it's not particular to what I do in my day job, but it was the most profound book that I've ever read.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with it, but I'll have to look at it.
From a fiction perspective, whether it's a movie, TV show, book, is there something you're really into right now? Like, is there something in the pop culture space that you're like, oh, this is really interesting, keeping your attention?
Let's see. I mean, honestly, I've been really intrigued by the potential for AI-generated music. So even though all of the recordings have been pretty lackluster so far, that I've been going on some pretty deep rabbit holes on.
Huh. I wonder how long before we're going to start getting like a lot of AI driven, like, screenplays or movies or TV shows or other things as well.
It's already happening. Yeah.
Yeah,
You think so?
It's in the works.
There's
I
some,
think
there's some
it's
interesting
for
examples.
sure happening.
Yeah.
Well, so then we'll have to figure out which ones are AI driven and which ones aren't. There'll probably be a whole cottage industry trying to call, like AI on people. Like, that's fake. You didn't write that. The AI wrote it for you.
Whole business right there.
Yeah. So, I know, Robbie, you're into the open source, side of things. Do you have a favorite open source tool that you use on a regular basis?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think from my perspective, I have less time to use tools and more time to just be looking at investing in tools. I'm really excited about one of the companies that we invested in called Elementary Data. It's an open source data observability tool. And I'm super active in their Slack channel. I think everybody thinks that I'm regularly using the tool because I'm always commenting on videos, but that's one that I'm really excited about. And then, I'll say, and this is more of a tracking standpoint, I'm always looking at OSS Insight. I just think it's like a great site to just get data, which is what I'm always looking for.
Yeah.
Shout out to the Pink Cap folks. Yeah.
Yeah, they did a great job on that, and I've used that all the time as well. Like, there's so much you can do. There's so much data you can just mine. It's crazy. Yeah. So, you attend conferences, I'm sure. You've gone to a few tech conferences in the past. What was the first tech conference you went to, and what was that experience like?
Oh, man. First tech conference, because I've been investing for now 8 years. First one ever may have been Dreamforce, like way back when. Now I actually try to go to like smaller conferences. It was funny, even a few years ago, I feel like KubeCon was like much smaller, like pre-pandemic than it is now. But a lot of like smaller meetups now. I think like RSA is going on right now in San Francisco, and it's just bananas and huge. Like they've just gotten so big.
Yeah, I mean, some of those conferences, even like Dreamforce as well. Like, it's just so large, you take over half the city.
Yeah.
San Francisco can barely handle the size of those conferences. Dreamforce clogs up so much.
Oh, totally. There was a year, I want to say this is probably like 4 or 5 years ago, where they had a ship that was docked in San Francisco that was just housing people for Dreamforce, which is crazy. Actually, right now I have another friend who's also a software infrastructure investor who's staying with me because it was just so expensive to get a hotel during RSA. So it's just gone completely bananas.
Yeah, I mean, that's always crazy. So if you do go to a conference and they do invite you to speak at said conference, what music do you ask them to play as you walk up to the stage, by the way?
Oh, it's so funny. I've never actually been asked this question. And I feel like if I was asked, I would have to think through it because there's like songs that I love, but I don't think like Lose Yourself by Eminem would really make sense for me to like walk up to like a random tech conference.
It could be fun. Yeah.
So I would probably have to like do more soul searching for it.
Fair enough. I mean, that's one of those questions that like it's difficult to answer, but we're going to come up with a playlist, right? So it's going to be like the official playlist of this, podcast, right? So it'll be fun. So let us know so we can add it. So what's your favorite snack food? If you're gonna grab a snack food, what's it gonna be?
I am a big peanut butter and jelly on toast person, so pretty boring, pretty standard. I love the consistency.
That's great. Yeah,
Nothing wrong with the classics.
Yeah, you got to go with the classics.
Throw some banana on there if you're really trying to spice it up. Maybe even honey.
Wow. Yeah, look at that. You're getting a little more eclectic there with the peanut butter. Yeah. And let me ask you the final question here.
Oh, okay, good. No, good. I was going to wrap us up on this.
See, I told you 10 minutes, and he's like, but it's only been 8, so I get one more question. Curious, if you were going to have a superpower, which superpower would that be?
So this is one that I might regret, but the ability to read minds. I feel like I want to have that for a day and then see what it's like, because I feel like that could be a very dark thing to go through life.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Perhaps.
All right. So, I don't know, Robbie, can you read my mind right now? What is the next question? Like, no? Okay.
No,
that's okay.
Don't have that yet.
Darn. Okay. Well, maybe next time. So, maybe, Robbie, I know we went through some questions here, but maybe introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm Robby. I'm a software infra seed investor, and I'm based in San Francisco, but I'm originally from Toronto. So shout out to all my Canadians listening. And I've been in the Bay Area for now 11 years. I came out here for my first job in tech investment banking and then moved over to venture a couple of years after that. And then have just loved being in early stage investing and been doing that for like 8 or 9 years now.
So how did you first get into investing? Like that's something that's a little like, it's not something that people jump into right away generally.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I'll actually start a little bit before that because I think how I got into tech banking was more interesting. I did my summer internship for my last summer in college in Toronto, and at the time there really wasn't much of a tech scene in Toronto. It's grown quite a bit, but as far as like tech M&A, that just wasn't existent. And so if you do investment banking in Toronto, you're really working with natural resource companies like metals and mining companies, like one mine buying another, maybe retail. And so I just thought it'd be way more interesting to work in tech banking. And so I cold called a bunch of different tech banks, which is a skill that actually came in handy for venture and for sourcing. Yeah, I cold called a bunch of banks, and then a bunch of them wouldn't sponsor visas. And then I found this Chicago-based bank called William Blair that had a tech office doing just sell-side M&A in San Francisco, and convinced them to hire me without them appreciating that they had to sponsor my visa. So they then learned that after the fact, after they had hired me. And so then I came out, and sell-side M&A really means that you're working with founders, helping them figure out how to position to like buyers. And I loved working with founders. I thought it was so interesting thinking through their story, how like they could be valued by external players and like what their journey's been like. But it's super transactional. You basically work with them at a point in time and then help them get acquired. And so I really wanted to like have a longer and more impactful like part in the entire founder journey. So I went to Norwest and I was doing early to late stage venture there. I didn't think I wanted to do venture before I like went to Norwest. It just kind of happened that way. And then I loved it once I was there and wanted to focus really early, which is why I came to Cowboy. So that's my very condensed background or resume.
That is super cool to hear. And one thing that was super interesting about was cold calling. I think that a lot of people, especially developers, really could never see themselves doing that. But if you start a business, you may find yourself doing a little bit of that. What did you learn from that experience of cold calling? Like how did that shift your perspective on anything?
Oh, totally. And I completely agree because I think when people think of cold calling, when it comes to like being a founder, you think of just sales, but actually cold calling is a skill that you'll use in recruiting, that you'll use when you're trying to like maybe get partnerships or get PR. Like there are just a bunch of different ways where you going out, reaching out to someone, forming a relationship is just super valuable from a company building perspective. And for me, it was really powerful because it made me realize that I could have a lot more say in my future and like where I go, and I didn't necessarily have to be warm introed or have prior connections in order to like get somewhere. And so it just gave me this feeling of agency, and so that kind of like set me off as far as okay, now like I could cold call my way into another country. Like I think I can cold call into founders, and I actually like really, especially when I was at Norwest, there were some pretty crazy like late stage companies that I was able to get in front of with like different cold calling tactics, including like Scale AI and companies that like I think it would have been really hard if I wasn't just really ballsy with my cold calling for us to just like get in front of and talk to the founders.
Do you have any advice for people who think that they are not good at it?
I think make it authentic to you. So I think like just being genuine about why you want to talk to someone is so powerful, where like if I reach out to you and I'm like, hey, I think Scarf is awesome because I've been using it and like a couple of my companies use it and like I just think the product's super cool. Like I'd love to just chat about it more, and like totally fine if you're not fundraising. That's way more compelling than like, hey, I'm a VC, like I have money that I could give you and like I'm looking for interesting investments. Like it's just the way that you approach things, and I think the more authentic you are with cold calling, the more likely you are to be successful.
Very much agree. Shifting gears a little bit into, I think, kind of some of the meat of the conversation that I was most excited to talk to you about. You put out a super interesting article on Medium about, can my open source company raise a Series A? You want to just kind of maybe just for the audience that has not read it, just maybe kind of very briefly summarize and we can dive in from there?
Yeah, definitely. So this actually was never intended to be a like public facing Medium post. I ran this survey because a few of my open source companies were thinking about their like next round of funding. A number of those are Series A's. And they wanted to know, based on where the market is now versus a year and a half ago, if they like how they should plan for their open source metrics, but also commercial strategies to get to a place where they could successfully raise Series A from the top Series A investors. And for context, why this I think is particularly important for open source companies is you had like, call it like 2-ish years ago, maybe like 1.5 to 3.5 years ago, open source companies that were able to raise off of just open source traction and like raise really big rounds. I put the example in the Medium post of Airbyte Series A, where it was 25 million Series A and an awesome team, awesome market, but like nothing on the commercial side yet, very early as far as a lot of their open source metrics. And so that is like, in my view, was clouding a lot of really early stage companies' views of what they needed to get to in order to successfully raise Series A. So in order to just kind of like get some data to back what I thought was going to be the case for the Series A market, I surveyed a bunch of my friends who are Series A investors. I think there ended up being like 19 or 20 of them, and got data about what they were looking for. And so I just packaged it up, sent it to my companies. They thought it was super valuable because there were some insights in there that weren't obvious around the metrics that those investors thought were most important, around how many of them had actually changed their views on monetization. And they hadn't necessarily shared that publicly, but in this, anonymized format where it was like a bunch of different opinions, they like kind of, I think, shared more freely. So it turned into a blog post just because I thought it could be something that other founders could benefit from. And then I've actually heard subsequently that there are some founders that have used those metrics in board slides and have been like really driving towards metrics to hit there, which I mean is super exciting.
Yeah, and what's interesting is we've talked to several founders in the last couple of months where we've asked them about their different series and fundraising, and a lot of them have been like, "Oh, we haven't had to think revenue yet," or it's a very late even thought process to them. And so that is starting to change, especially in the market. So your blog post was very timely, but it's really interesting to hear like, oh no, we just decided for, like 4 years or 3 years, we're not going to focus on revenue at all. And we've heard that. And is that unusual? Like, I mean, that has changed, right?
So it's interesting. It has changed, but my view on this is you can't kind of go into monetizing an open source community in a rushed way, because it's like, first and foremost, it's a community that's centered around the movement that is your project. And so you can't really approach it the same way as a typical like freemium tool. But at the same time, because of how much capital has been in the market and where the expectations are for revenue, there's kind of this like mismatch going on. So I actually think that like, if you're going to raise like a larger seed, like 3 to 5 million, then you have to get to like pretty substantial commercial traction by Series A. But I actually think like the right answer is going to end up being a lot of these companies raising smaller like pre-seed rounds, like in the like 500K to 1.5 million, then raising a seed, and then by Series A getting to enough traction where they can like show commercial proof points, show the ability that their project has to like generate pipeline and revenue. But yeah, it's there. I think like this was also one of the goals of the post, where I just think that like there's a disconnect between what I'm hearing from investors and like seeing in public markets on expectations revenue wise versus early stage founders, especially first time founders, because they're looking at like, okay, well, my friend who's also an open source founder, raised a $5 or $6 million seed round, and like then they're like planning to raise Series A with like no commercial traction. And so I just wanted there to be a data set out there to level set.
Fair enough. So when you are thinking about, let's take a step back and look at the early stage before we go too deep into the Series A. What are you looking for your kind of like investments? What sort of things are you looking for in terms of like the demographics, the idea, the founder? Like what sort of things are important to you?
Yeah, so it's interesting because at my stage, so I do pre-seed and seed investing. I would say my definition of pre-seed is anything that's like $1.5 million or lower, and then seed would be like $1.5 million to $5 million. And so at both stages, the most important things are like the founders and why they're the best founders to go after a certain market and how big that market opportunity is. Like, can that market sustain a multi-billion-dollar company? And That's similar across both, though I would say for open source companies at pre-seed, oftentimes there might not even be a project that's out yet. It's really just an idea, a team. Maybe they've built things that are relevant before, or they just have learned to be experts in a certain domain or space. For seed, usually there is some open source traction if it's an open source company that we're looking at. And I'm looking for signals that will point, actually very much in line with the Series A metrics, that will point towards there being a market opportunity there. And so certain things that I'm looking for are there like high quality users using that tool versus just hobbyists? And are users using that tool in production? Like, is it a project that is going to be meaningful? And so like my definition of production is if something breaks in the project, is it going to affect end user experiences? And I also look for like another way to talk about production is whether it's being used in like a automated fashion, but we're kind of looking for like the depth of integration for the project.
Oh, go ahead, Matt, if you had something.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's really interesting when you talk specifically about the production users. I mean, I know that's in your blog as well. From a production user perspective, a lot of times, especially in the open source space, unless you're doing a cloud service, it's difficult for a lot of these projects to understand, hey, these are users in production. Because telemetry is such a negative term for a lot of folks in the open source space. So typically, what are you seeing those founders bring to the table in terms of, like, hey, here's what we're reporting, or here's how we're trying to bring traction around those production users?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Abby can also speak to this because I think he also is very familiar with companies trying to fix the fact that there isn't great telemetry. But there are a bunch of ways that I've seen companies not necessarily get around that, but just figure out how to align with their community on just like who's in it, how they're using it. I mean, first and foremost, almost every project or open source company is going to have a like Discord or Slack community, and so there's always like intro channels in there. There are folks like talking about the problems that they're having at the companies that they're at, that the project's solving. I have also seen a number of companies, like Airbyte was one of them actually. We talked a lot about this with Michel when he was on the Open Source Startup podcast, where you can have opt-ins or opt-outs as far as like taking user information. I think you just don't want your project users to feel like they're getting, like scraped and they don't know about it. Like you just kind of want to have this alignment on expectations. And that's a very common theme, I think, throughout building an open source company is just making sure you're aligned and you're communicating openly and transparently with the community. So I actually think like a lot of community members are totally fine with the like project or company sitting on top of the project knowing who they are, but you just don't want to like surprise them. Where I think one example of this going really poorly is like seeing a user in your Discord channel and then put in like they work at Stripe and then putting Stripe as a user on your like website and you don't even know if they're like using it or not. Like so like that I've seen things like that like not go well. But yeah, this telemetry problem is a tough one. There are ways around it, but you just have to, I think, be thoughtful about addressing it with your community.
So if someone's pitching to you and here's our logo wall, like what is the typical thing that you're finding is kind of the burden of proof of that, if there is one? Like, is there, I mean, yeah.
No, totally. It's, so it's funny because I don't really spend that much time on slide decks. And even when like companies are pitching us, I usually opt for them not to use it because what I'm really looking for is depth of interaction with the users and how well they understand like user pain points. So what I would look for is, or like, let's say they were going over like, here are all my project users on a slide. Like, okay, like I see Elastic on there. Like talk to me about Elastic. How are they using it? And they'll be like, okay, well, we had like this one user join our Slack. And then we started talking to her about how she had implemented the project. And she was actually looking to replace this other SaaS tool with this. And the rest of her team started using it. Like that's what I'm looking for is that like depth of engagement with users. Mm-hmm. Which is actually not just for open source. Like I'm with any B2B company that I'm looking at, which usually ends up being like a dev tool or security or data infra company, I'm looking for that connection with the user journey. And with open source, I think you can accidentally fall into the trap of feeling like because there's a Slack group, because there are like metrics around like GitHub star growth or issue growth or whatever, thinking that there's more engagement there. And so I think like maybe back to our earlier talk about like cold calling and like have the founders actually reached out and gotten to know their users and their pain points, and do they really understand their journey and are they really building for them?
Yeah, I think that's a really underrated aspect of kind of the company building at the really early stages, is just like how much you're going to learn from building very deep relationships with those early users. And it's, yeah, I guess sometimes tempting to either, you know, over index on it or under index on it. It's a very hard balance, I think. Yeah, I guess I'm curious if you find that there's kind of a lot of people really, what am I trying to ask? Like, really, like, kind of just you're trying to juggle user feedback so much that you just get distracted a lot from what, you know, the actual business goals. I'm kind of curious, like, when you see founders, are you looking more for blinders on, I have conviction of my vision, or I am, you know, I'm listening to everything the community says and I do whatever the community tells me? Obviously, there's somewhere in the middle, but I'm curious how you think about what that middle is.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, because the benefit to product when building in an open source manner is that you get so much feedback from the community, but you get so much feedback from the community that it's also a downside where you don't necessarily want to just be building kind of small features if you're building towards a bigger vision and just get stuck with just the noise of that. So I actually, I think about this in like different ways. So I think as an open source founder, you have to learn how to decipher signals and like what signals are going to be important and what aren't. Armand at HashiCorp talks about how the signals that he was looking for early on were tastemaker users. So like really high quality users that he thought were going to be driving the like next like tech adoption wave. And so feedback from those users was super valuable versus feedback from other like hobbyists, for example, or folks who like wouldn't necessarily be the influencers for a given tech kind of subsector. It's like rating some user feedback over others. So I think like just knowing that this is I think with most things open source, you can almost use it to really benefit you, but it can also drown you. It's the same with like the pipeline aspect of being able to take your open source community, and that's a community that you make money from. If you treat it too much like a typical sales pipeline, you almost counteract the fact that it's open source. You destroy the community. So it's kind of like an art more than anything else, where like same with product feedback, you can get so much from your community, but it's up to you to find the signal through the noise and also not like get stuck in just small feature requests to satisfy individual users if it doesn't work with your roadmap. I think like one way I've seen companies do this really effectively is like they take that feedback, they set expectations, because you also don't want to not answer users if they're asking for certain things, but then they're just very open about their product roadmap too. Like I love open source founders who are like posting publicly their roadmap. And so users can like follow along and be part of your journey and can maybe add to it, but it's ultimately being driven by the project creators and the visionaries for the project or the technology. So I think it's a really good question, but it's something that is really, really tough to do. And I think probably something that a lot of open source founders don't think about early on as much is like the drawbacks of having so many signals.
Right. So okay, we have a you know some understanding of what you're looking for at pre-seed and seed investments, and now you have these metrics, or you have a semblance of what Series A investors are looking for, kind of these different things, and like production users, I think, is just one of really, really resonates, I think, because that's ultimately like what's going to get you closest to having a sustainable business. For the companies in your portfolio, what are you seeing as kind of the typical things that are the hardest about making this jump from seed to Series A?
I think repeatability is what Series A investors are looking for, but is also really, really hard, because I think it's easy to trick yourself into saying you have, and I actually tie repeatability to product market fit, where you like, if you have like service market fit, or you have like product market fit, but it just requires so much like customization. It's not something that's repeatable. That's not truly like venture scale product market fit. But like if you truly have something repeatable where it's like, hey, here's my go-to-market motion is early, but it's repeatable. Like the products that I'm delivering are like deployable in like a very similar way. Like that's really what Series A investors are looking for and where I want all of our companies to get to. But it's easy to trick yourself into saying you have that when you don't. And it's also easy to have product market fit and assume that you're going to keep that. Like one of the things that's been hardest for companies the last year is you might have had a product market fit in an up market where your tool was looked at as a like very valuable high ROI tool when the market is up. And now suddenly it no longer is like you don't have product market fit in a down market. Like an obvious example of that is like things in marketing tech or a lot of things in HR tech where if you're not hiring, like certain recruiting tools are just no longer going to be like a must-have tool for you. So I think it's really like understanding and reassessing your product market fit is the hardest thing to do, and being super open about it and like tweaking things if you don't have it. But like that's ultimately when I think of, and the last few years have been kind of weird where there's been a lot of Series A's that happened before true product market fit, but it's hard to do.
Yeah, and you mentioned like the repeatable process and having that repeatability, you know, like the sustainability there. And what's really interesting is from a lot of people in open source, they can get some semblance of traction in the open source community, but that doesn't necessarily translate into commercial success. Yeah. You can have a really, really wide audience and a lot of people who love your software, but no one who's willing to pay for it. And I've seen that in a lot of cases. And I don't know if that's something that you've run into as you've evaluated companies or you've looked at communities or experienced that. I'm curious your thoughts on that, where, you know, they have something that is really universally loved, but it's really difficult to monetize. It's really difficult to make something that is commercially viable.
Yeah, this goes back to the market point initially, where if like a project could get, or like software in general could get widely adopted, but if it's not in a category where there's going to be budget for it, and budget really comes from something significantly reducing costs or increasing revenue. Like ultimately that is the only time you're going to get enterprise budget for anything. And so if your tool is not doing that enough, it could even be a must-have tool, but it's just not providing enough ROI for someone to pay enough for it, then there isn't going to be a big enough market. So actually, to give an example of like the company that one of the companies I invested in, Elementary Data, it's in the data observability space, which there is budget for. There are companies like Monte Carlo, Datafold, like this concept of looking for potential errors or issues in your data pipeline. Like there's already clear budget for that. So this is like a new take on a product for that category where it's solving a pain point that companies can pay like a sizable ACV for. For net new categories, you have to be somehow replacing some sort of manual process, but it's all about the like ROI that you're delivering. And I think that's where there's this disconnect between, you could have project market fit where your project is serving a need for the market and for free users, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have product market fit where there's a paid product that people are going to pay for that services a need that is like a huge market opportunity. So it like not all projects should become companies and should become companies. And I think the venture industry has also contributed to this kind of, I think, misnomer around open source traction equals high potential to build a really big company, because it's not always the case.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's that millions of users, you know, conundrum, right?
Yeah.
I've got, you know, millions of downloads, millions of users, whatever. Like, you know, this is deployed on every website known to man. But what does that mean in terms of like commercial options? And, you know, more often than not, when I've talked with startups, you know, they might have great traction in the open source space, but they only have a handful of companies that are willing to pay for it. And that means a lot of people rely more on those larger enterprises and less on the kind of like the small, medium-sized businesses, because, you know, in the sports analogy, for those who follow sports, they look for more of that home run as opposed to like the singles or the smaller deals. Is that something that you see hear founders talk about like, oh, we've got millions of people, we should have millions of customers. And is that something that you have to temper their expectations, or are they coming in and realizing, yeah, maybe we're going to get a couple hundred paying customers, but we might have millions of users?
Yeah, I think some founders get that, some don't, because I think it's really hard when you see big numbers as far as users or usage. You see like your Slack community growing like crazy, and you're like, how could I not make like millions of dollars off this community? Like, look at how many people there are in here. But it's all like about the quality of that community. And I say quality in the sense of like quality to eventually pay. And this was actually in the survey that I ran, the second most important metric to Series A investors. And I would say like we look at this too quite a bit, is like quality of users in your community, because they will have access to budget, presumably, if you're in a category where there is budget or could be budget allocated. And so there's a higher propensity to pay, because if you have like hundreds of thousands even hobbyist users, and like they're using your product because it's free and it's great, but they have no budget, and like if it was paid, like this is the other thing that I talk to founders about when they have really big communities, but they're in a category where I have some questions on whether or not there's like an actual big market size there. It's like, okay, well, like how much would your users be willing to pay for? Because if you look at what a lot of, especially in the open core model, what's being monetized, a lot of times it's like team and enterprise readiness features. It's about scale, it's about collaboration, it's about SSO. It's like things that like a two-person shop they're never going to pay for. So I think it's like really, really understanding the category that you're in and assessing whether or not that category is one that can make a lot of money.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And you talked about like some of the monetization. You talked about open core, so ears perk up, and like, oh, good, we can move into the monetization discussions. Because I think this is interesting because over the last few years, there's been a lot of people who have shifted more focus away from open core, more to cloud services, right?
Yeah.
As their method, and there's a variety of reasons for that. I mean, I think and I've done open core for 20 plus years. And it's hard to renew open source and open core because a lot of times the features are nice to haves and not necessarily requirements. And so that means that as soon as somebody loses the value of a support contract or, maybe finds an alternative to do some, little niche thing, they're going to ditch you for the free version. And the cloud version tends to be more sticky. It has that, oh, you're relying on us. It's more difficult to kind of get out of. Have you seen people coming back to the open core side of things lately? Because I know a lot of companies that I've chatted with, their SaaS offerings, maybe they didn't hit the numbers that they wanted, or they're running into that issue where a lot of larger companies still want an enterprise version that they run on-prem. So I don't know what your experience is in that.
Yeah, I think so. I actually have seen a lot of companies be successful having both, because I actually think that you can pretty easily have like both of those monetization strategies and make a good amount of money. I mean, there's pros and cons to each. With open core, you can, and it depends on what your definition of open core is. Like if you're building like truly valuable features on top, then that also adds defensibility too. Whereas in a cloud hosting model, you don't always have that defensibility. Like a much bigger, much better resource company, especially if you're really early, can suddenly have like a cloud hosting service and provide like better functionality there. So I think like, but it does align much better with the community where like you're giving basically like everything to the open source and you're just providing a cloud hosted solution for anybody who's paying for that. But I ultimately think like most companies are going to have both long term. It's really like where you start. And there's definitely some exceptions to that. But I think like, at the end of the day, as long as you're adding value to your community and you're like that's what your community wants. Like if there's a ton of demand and like a lot of potential dollars to go behind a cloud hosted service early on for your company, like for sure go down that route. And I think like a lot of data platform companies have gone that route. It's just made way more sense. But if it makes sense for your tool and your community to instead add more enterprise readiness features or even just like collaboration features because that's how your tool is being used, then I think it really just comes down to what your community is willing to pay for. And I think the most successful founders that I've worked with and talked to, they just have such a good understanding of their community and user base and like what would make sense to try and like monetize or commercialize with them. And so it's like less of a coming up with your business model in a vacuum and more like a collaborative. Like I think that piece is really important to align with your community on, even more than product roadmap.
So you're not really advising like, oh, this is what we want to see, or that you don't have a preference right now. It's whatever makes the most sense for that product.
Whatever makes most sense for the product, 100%. Because it's like I have an open source mobile testing tool, and then I have like a data observability, and then another like infra observability. It's a totally different user, totally different needs, different like size companies using those products.
So I'd be curious. So I definitely understand that that's something that's really hard to generalize. But given that you have both, set up portfolio companies with Cowboy Ventures, and then you've also talked to a ton of founders on your podcast, do you have some sense of what the breakdown is of that sample of companies for where people are starting with this and what's been more successful? Like, let's just say in the short term, from like pre-seed to like Series A or B, for instance. I'd be very keen to hear like what the breakdown looks like.
It's a good question. I would say it's definitely been moving the direction of more cloud hosting for sure. Like I would say like 8 years ago, way more open core. Now it's probably more split. And then for bigger companies, like you can look on like, any public open source company site, they have both. But now I would say the ability to offer a cloud-hosted solution is easier than it used to be. There's just like more tooling around that. But I would say that it's more common now to see like cloud hosting earlier than before. But I would still go back to it depends on who your user base is and what they want and what they need.
Yeah, certainly. Let's see. Matt, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I can, of course. I always have follow-ups.
Or actually,
I can follow up.
I love Matt. I love your thought on it because it sounds like you may lean more towards cloud hosting, but maybe I'm reading.
Well, no. So this is interesting. So there's actually a couple of interesting data points here. A lot of companies that I've seen are starting to take their open core features and not release them as part of even the enterprise and force people to choose the cloud, which is a really weird trend, and I think potentially a little dangerous in some cases. One of the value props for open source has always been that kind of like choose your own adventure, have your freedom of movement. And, hey, my philosophy's always been in the open source space, pay me because our stuff is better than the other guys. And if it's not, you shouldn't pay us. Right. And I think that philosophy resonates well with a lot of people in the community side of things. But I do see kind of this trend where from a cloud hosting perspective, more and more folks are moving that direction, but this is not without risk from a technical standpoint, right? From a technical standpoint, now what you're doing is you're taking, these projects that and applications that might have really tightly controlled ecosystems and then distributing it and having, company A, manage a little tiny sliver and company B. And so, that's great if it works. But you start to end up getting locked into some of these features and get stuck there. So there is some danger there. But I've also seen that where most of this happens is in the infrastructure side of things. So, database companies or, security companies, people who are focused on the infrastructure side, which inherently is so low level that a lot of developers don't want to think about it. So it's easier for them to go the cloud services. But from the people who, the SREs, the DevOps folks, the people who have to manage it, oftentimes they run into the pain points later on and kind of inherit the issues, if you will, which is a whole nother thing, right? But there's a whole, back and forth on whether cloud or open core is the right way. And I agree with you that having both, because you're going to have users who prefer one over the other.
Yeah.
But I do see in the enterprise space, especially when you're talking banks, highly regulated industries, there is an aversion still to a lot of these cloud providers or SaaS services. And some of the companies that I've worked for in the past on the infrastructure side, they've run into that where they're like, we're 100% cloud. And then like they talk to a bank and then they're like, we're 100% open core, like, because it's, this company has lots of money and, they want to use our stuff, but we can't give it to them in the way that they want. So that hybrid is honestly the way to go, because you're going to have the companies that do just value the easy button, and you're going to have companies that, can't use it.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Just,
and I think it's like
so
figuring out
work.
what works for each of your users.
Yeah.
Yep. Just as an aside, I think it's just really tricky for founders really early on when you just don't have the resources to do all of those things. Like it's so it's such a big decision for the early trajectory of your company. Like it's really tough to just say, oh, we'll do both. But it does seem like a lot of successful companies land there eventually. So I guess just learning kind of the right path to pick is a really interesting.
But I think Avi, and that token, like you exchange easy for freedom, number one, of like movement, but you also
Right.
then put a lot of trust into those providers. And I mean, as we've seen, like we've had bills that go up, like, and we're not sure why, and then all of a sudden we run into, we used more than we should have just because we didn't necessarily understand what was going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, we at Scarf are going to move off of RDS. We got hit with some crazy database bills just from I/O of a Metabase cluster. We're going to write a blog post about this because it's a whole thing. But it was really easy to get started with RDS. You just click a button, and it's up, and that's great. And then I move on to the next thing, and who knows what would have happened if I was iterating on all these low-level things that was just kind of wasting time.
Yeah.
But now, yikes.
Yeah, I think Ben Hindman on our podcast said it really well, where he said, like, when you start off, as long as you fit in the box, it's wonderful. But once you start to have those needs that go outside that box, that's when, other options might be better. So,
Yeah. Let's see. So I guess other things that we were keen to talk to you about. So one of them, do you want to maybe talk about Modern Angels a little bit?
I would love to. So this also was never intended to be the community that it's turned into, but it just like I saw a need where there were a few of my friends who had gotten to pretty significant levels in their operating careers. So one CMO at a public fintech company, the other's head of strategy at Figma, and I had pulled them in to do angel investments with us at Cowboy, and I just assumed, because I knew they wanted to angel invest, that they were doing this with other firms too. And we were having dinner one night, and they were like, yeah, no, we would love to, but nobody sends us deal flow. So I was like, okay, that seems kind of funny. Like, I feel like a lot of founders would love to have you on their cap tables. Like, you should just make it better known that you're angel investing. So I collected their information about check sizes that they would be willing to invest, their sectors that they'd be interested in, what they would like to like work with founders on specifically. I put it into a Google sheet, and then I added a few other like female friends I knew that wanted to get into angel investing. And then I tweeted about it, and I had like 100 women DM me. It was crazy. And it was like really successful operators, like the VP of product at HubSpot, the CMO at Loom, the GM of The Gap. Like, and I was like, this is crazy. Like, how are none of you angel investing if you want to? And it just seemed like there hadn't been a community built for a lot of like female operators to just like learn from each other and invest together. And so I never started a syndicate because it's gonna be really hard to operationalize. I also wanted to make it as easy as possible for these angels to get into like really hot investment rounds. So I shared that database with a bunch of friends who are in venture at different like top tier firms. It's now 350 women, so it's grown quite a bit. And everyone's in the Slack community and like talk about deal flow. And it's just been a really awesome way for a lot of operators to get into angel investing. Actually, a number of the women who I got to know over the last year and a half in that group are now in VC. And like that was a good kind of place for them to start investing. But yeah, for anybody listening, I think like one of the things that I'm trying to do with this group, apart from just teaching folks who are operators and want to learn about angel investing to do that really well, is help bridge the access gap. And I think like having diversity in your cap table, like it's just, I mean, it's who do you want to be working and making money for? Like a diverse group of individuals is usually the answer. And usually there's an access gap for whatever reason. And so I like have a database that's very well organized as far as the expertise that you might want. So I'm always happy to give access to really awesome founders raising venture-backed rounds.
I've found that I was kind of surprised by how useful Scarf's group of angel investors have been. It was one of those things where going in, it was, oh, well, if someone's going to give me money, I'm like, let's talk to them for sure. And it was really all about that. And I didn't super at the time, like at the very beginning for our first round, think a whole lot about the strategicness of every person that I might have been talking to. And I was lucky that it just kind of fell out that way, that these people were very, very strategic for us in the long run. But I think it's something that I would advise a lot of founders to think about a lot, is just, these are people that, are going to be in your corner, and, anywhere from someone that you never, you just talk to once in a while when you need something, to someone that is responding to every single investor update that you send out. And that can just be so valuable over time. And so I definitely recommend to consider that to founders who are about to raise money. Yeah. I guess on the side of founders specifically in open source, do you find yourself giving similar advice a lot to people? And I'm curious what that advice looks like.
Oh, that's such a good question. Because yes, I definitely do, especially because we work with a lot of first-time founders. So a lot of what they come up against is similar in a sense. The biggest piece of advice is around how you're going to measure and keep yourself honest on product market fit, because there's just this sense of we'll hear it from founders so often where they're like, oh, look at this awesome pipeline we have, or look at all these free users we have, or look at all the engagement. And it's yes, but that doesn't mean you have product market fit. You have to be really honest with yourself around is what I've done so far, is it pointing towards there being a big market opportunity, and to what degree? Because there might be small signals, but I think it's easy to be optimistic and lean too hard into small signals. So I think it's really, really knowing if you have a commercially viable opportunity. And that's mostly specific to open source, because that's where you get that disconnect between traction and market.
Let me ask this then, because I'm really curious. And this is something that I hear different people have different answers to. To you, what is product market fit?
It's honestly a mathematical equation. It is, you
Great.
have, yeah, no, you have a set of users that will be in hopefully they're paying an amount to start with that can point to this, but will be willing to pay enough to generate a really big market size. And so a benchmark for that early on is are there enough users out there willing to pay you enough that you can generate 100 million ARR with your business? And just truly, is the functional area that you're going after one where you, for whatever your tool does, can you generate that much from it? That it is purely math for me from a product market fit. Project market fit, totally different. And you may never be able to get to a venture scale product market fit point, but it's is there a big market opportunity that you're hitting on? There's enough users you can sell to, and they're going to pay enough for it, given how many of them would buy this. And then
is your number 100 million? Is your number 100 million?
For our stage, yeah, usually.
Okay.
Well, it's rare to get such a clean answer to a question like that, so thank you.
It's funny because it's at the end of the day, on the venture side of things, we're investing in companies we think can go public. And how are public companies measured on how much revenue and we're investing so early, so there's a lot of squinting that happens to be able to see if this is possible. But it's it's funny because we've invested in so many companies where I invested in this SOC 2 automation company, and now broader compliance automation company called Drata. And if you looked at market research reports, it would say the compliance automation market is 100 million total, and Drata's worth $2 billion. So anyway, it doesn't have to be oh, you put this Gartner report and this market size. It's really a question of what value are you adding to users vis-a-vis how much they're willing to pay, and how many potential users do you have? It's you can simplify it quite a bit.
Yeah. That's a good business, Strata. We're about to do SOC 2 as well at Scarf. So
Oh,
very
you have to
relevant
work
to
with
us at this
Strata.
point in time. Now I definitely do. Well, cool. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I think, Robby, thank you so much for all of the insights and wisdom here. For anyone listening, if you haven't read her blog post on Series A for open source startups, you have to read it. And also check out her podcast, Open Source Startup. It's a great podcast. So, Robby, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you both. This was super fun.
All right. Thanks.